Greetings, IB folks. Welcome to another lovely edition of the Cold War. This one, obviously, Chapter 2.2 Communist Success in China and its Relations with the USSR and the United States. A lot of this is going to be review as we look back into Maoist China and the CCP takeover. A little different perspective, though, with Russia coming in from the north. So a little more information that should help you kind of create a bigger picture, a broader sense of what was going on in that area. Um, as we near the Second World War and the Chinese Civil War was taking place, our time period, 1937 to 1949. Um, the recognized government in power was Jiang Jieshi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek. As you can see him here hanging out with Mao. Clearly the leader of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, and the Nationalists, as I will refer to them for the rest of this section. There was an uneasy alliance between the CCP and the Kuomintang. CCP was pushing to overthrow the warlords and the other rulers of Japan, trying to get control from the side of the peasantry. Also, the Kuomintang was allied with the USSR as well as the CCP a little bit, but for the most part, the Russians leaned toward supporting the nationalists as well because they were centered in the cities using the proletariat rather than the peasantry. So once again, you have that difference between Marxism and Maoism. The CCP early alliance ended with the purge of the CCP members and the Long March in October of 34. So, as you remember, prior to this time period, you have the first United Front, the first unification between the CCP and the Kuomintang, and it falls apart when Chiang Kai-shek tries to kill all the communists and tries to chase Mao and his supporters across China. He doesn't manage to get rid of them all. So when we jump to 1937, China is, of course, invaded by the Japanese in Manchukuo. The Second United Front is then established in order to face this growing fight. The CCP is allowed to establish liaison offices in the cities. This is another part of eroding Chiang Kai-shek's support. Is now not only does Mao have the peasants, but of course he's starting to build support in the cities. He does that by publishing the New China Daily newspaper, which is basically just a propaganda arm for Mao and the CCP. The Second United Front falls apart in 1941. The nationalist forces were decimated by the Japanese. Along the coast, they flee inland, which makes them basically running into Mao and his forces. The CCP basically just hung back and watched, knowing that if the nationalist forces were decimated when the war was over, they could pick up the pieces and be in control of the nation. So they used that war period to gain power, gain support, propagandize against Chiang Kai-shek. In 1937, you've got about 40,000 CCP members or members of that party, and also a 92,000 man army. By the end of the war in 45, the CCP grows in strength to 1.2 million, with another 900,000 in the army. The CCP were seen to be the moral guiding light for China, as you can see in this upper picture, whereas the nationalists were seen more as a controlling, corrupt arm of kind of a bygone era that they were trying to get rid of. Also, Mao and the CCP had an amazing propaganda machine, like in this lovely picture here. And they had the support of the people. So the United States could not stomach trying to back another group of communists. So we, of course, support the nationalists. They were seen by us and by the Allies as the official power in China. We also use the Flying Tigers, a very famous group out of World War II, in order to try to supply the Chinese against the Japanese. There's very famous pictures of our transports flying over the Himalayas from India into China to try to supply the fight. Sung Mei Ling, Chiang Kai shek's wife, did several tours of the United States. On those tours, she did meet with the president's wife, Roosevelt's wife, as well as go on national radio on multiple different stations, here pictured for NBC, um, rallying for support for the nationalists and for China against the Japanese. So the American people truly did support Chiang Kai shek and the nationalist side. A lot of propaganda there too against the spreading of communism and stuff, even before the war was over. The USSR, in response, agreed to support the nationalists as long as they got a few concessions for their side. Number one, the nationalists had to recognize Mongolia as independent. A very beautiful place, Mongolia. But they wanted to make sure that China didn't grow in power and size, plus get all these resources. So they had to accept, accept Soviet acquisition of Tsarist lands. Mostly, they demanded access through railroads across Mongolia and into Manchukuo uh, to to get those resources. Stalin promised to withdraw from China 3 months after the Japanese defeat. Basically, what he had said is, if we go back to the fall of Germany, is that within 3 months of the fall of Germany, Russia would invade China. They gave the same promise to the Chinese that within 3 months after the fall of the Japanese, that they would leave China. So that doesn't exactly come true. The United States felt that the CCP was simply a Stalinist puppet. So they knew that Stalin was openly supporting the nationalists, but they also believed that, kind of behind the scenes, that the Communist Party of China must also be taking its marching orders from Stalin and uh, from the Russians. So it's not exactly true. The CCP refused to be subordinate to the Russians, as Stalin had ordered, which is again why he was supporting the nationalists. The Comintern, that's the word I was trying to remember. There we go. They were not taking orders from the Comintern as the United States believed. But either way, the alliance between the Russians and the CCP, as well as the Russians and the nationalists, was a very uneasy alliance that didn't really work out very well in the end. Jumping to the 8th of August, 1945. I highly recommend you watch this video. It's about 10 minutes, and it really shows just how dominant the Russians were once they rolled into China against the Japanese. They were highly successful, had much better equipment in their tanks and guns and artillery. A lot of that had been supplied to them by us in the war against the Nazis. We were flying planes all the way from Minnesota through Canada, Alaska, all the way across Siberia in order for the Russians to use them in Europe. So that supply line of of munitions and vehicles and planes allowed for Russia to have much better toys when they finally came into the Japanese fight. So watch this lovely video. It's only 10 minutes long. I will pause here just momentarily and then continue on. All right. As the video showed you, 1.5 million Russians march into Manchuria against 1 million Japanese. They are so dominant that they are able to make 700,000 Japanese surrender. Okay, the weapons they confiscate are then distributed to the CCP. So once again, here you have that uneasy alliance. Like the Russians are supposedly helping the nationalists, but then they give the weapons to the communists. So by late August of 45, the Japanese do surrender, of course, and the CCP and nationalist forces do move north into Manchukuo. The nationalists, of course, they take the cities. The CCP control the countryside, which once again gives them the more support of the folks. As the Civil War takes off between the nationalists and the CCP, in 1946, the United States continues to funnel aid to the nationalists. However, we don't want to get involved in the fight, so we do pull our Marines out of Beijing. We then funnel $500 million to the Chinese through the United Nations, basically pretending that it's the United Nations who were supporting them, but really it's all our money. 900 million worth of military equipment is also sold through the UN, but it's all American equipment. But we sell it at 175 million, so a huge discount. Once again, trying to prop up the nationalists, trying to stem the extension of communism. Um, there's a big debate between the Republicans, who at this time wanted to kind of back off and not give China all this money. They could kind of see that communism was spreading and that it wasn't going to work to try to stop it in China. Um, the Democrats at the time um, overrid overrode the Republicans because they didn't want to see themselves as weak. They thought that because they were the party in power, if they didn't stand up against the communists, that they would all basically be voted out of office. So they continued to support Jiang, even though it was clear that it was a losing fight. By October of 1949, the CCP claims victory. 2 million nationalists, mostly military, and their families flee to Taiwan. They establish a government in Taiwan. The United States and other United Nations allies continue to recognize the Republic of China as the true government of China, refusing to say that the People's Republic of China under Mao were the proper government. That, of course, isn't going to work out very well for us. But the Republic of China and Taiwan is the one recognized. Once we get into 1950, both Japan and Taiwan are recognized as being on the United States' sphere of influence. So basically, we establish an umbrella of protection for them, which is really the only reason why Mao's forces don't roll right into Taiwan and take it back. They're not ready to fight the United States. It is clear at this point that, from the Chinese perspective, it's because of the Americans that World War II was won. Clearly, there's more to it than that. The Russians helped a lot, of course, in Europe and such. But had the United States not been giving all of the weapons to the Russians to fight with, as well as fighting from our side and D-Day and everything we did there, uh, so the world kind of sees that without the United States, Europe would have lost. And then, of course, on the Pacific side, we basically single-handedly beat the Japanese on the water, and then we crush them with the atomic bomb. So China here has basically seen that, like, the United States has won this war, and they're not ready to fight us. So they uh, they leave Taiwan alone. I'm going to leave it at that. That is section 2.2. We will continue with 2.3 next week. Cheers.